Hi, everybody. Welcome to Red May, almost the tail end of Red May, our penultimate event for this 10th gathering in 10 years. Today, we're going to be having a really great panel that we've called Critical Theory and Social Form. And we're going to be hearing from 4 people talking about 3 new pieces of writing, 2 just published books, and a really interesting forthcoming essay. So before we get started, I'm just going to mention that there is one last event for Red May coming up. We are extending May into June, and it's an in-person event for those of you in Seattle. It's a book launch for a book by A.M. Gitlitz called Metropolitans, New York Baseball, Class Struggle, and the People's Team. And that's going to be on the 4th of June, Thursday, at 7 p.m. at Elliott Bay Books. And Trevor May will also be presenting. Sorry, if Trevor's a co-author, I apologize. But so that'll be the last event for this year. Meanwhile, here today, we've got 4 scholars, as I say, who are presenting from 3 kind of interlocking related pieces of work. And when we talked about it, we thought of putting it to you all this way. How did Marx critique capitalist society? And how can we draw on Marxist analysis of capital's internal logics to advance our own critiques of capitalist socialization? That is to say, not just the traditional economic stuff, but the way capital organizes society as a whole. We're interested in this, especially with regard to gendering and racializing processes on which Marx himself did not focus. I'm going to be moderating the roundtable, and we're today going to have Chris O'Kane, Amy DeAth, and then a shared presentation by Naima Karczmar and Andy Haas. I'm going to introduce them in the order that they're going to be presenting. So Chris O'Kane is a critical theorist who lives in Queens, New York. He's the author of the just published Social Constitution and Fetishistic Social Domination in Marx, Lukács, Adorno, and Lefebvre, and that's out from Brill. He has published widely on Marx, the Frankfurt School, and Marxian critical theory. Chris is a corresponding editor for the Historical Materialism Journal, and along with Werner Bonefeld, he edits the Critical Theory and Critique of Society book series. So we'll be hearing from Chris first about his new book. Amy DeAth is the author of another exciting brand new book called Behind Our Backs, Feminized Poetry and Capitalist Abstraction, just out from Stanford University Press. And so in addition to being the author of that book, she's also a poet and the author of a book from 2024, a really wonderful book called Not a Force of Nature. She's also the editor of Total Sexual Difference, a dossier forthcoming from the Mediations Journal this June, so just around the bend. She lives in Boston on the unceded territories of the Massachusetts and Mashpee Wampanoag First Peoples, where she is currently assistant professor of English at Tufts University. And then we have some co-presenters who are going to round things out for us. Naima Karczmar is a PhD candidate in English and critical theory at UC Berkeley, where she works on racialization and the rise of the novel. Her poems, she's also a poet, her poems and nonfiction have appeared in Poetry Northwest, the Michigan Quarterly Review, and the Iowa Review, and she's also made them appear in people's living rooms, a time-honored Bay Area tradition. Andy Haas is also a PhD candidate in the English department at UC Berkeley. His dissertation, Twilight of the Idol, Unemployment and the Crisis of Modern Representation, studies the relationship of artistic modernism, post-Kantian critical philosophy, and theories and representations of unemployment in the 19th and 20th centuries. So please give a hearty, if virtual, Red May welcome to our presenters. And Chris O'Kane, why don't you start us off?
Thanks, Chris. Thanks to Red May for inviting me, and to Amy, Andy, and Naima for sharing their important work. Since this is the 10th Red May, I want to take a minute to thank John, the Red May Collective, and especially Philip for all the work they've put in over the past 10 years. Red May, has become a very important venue for the best of leftist thought. And I think it's also a model for the sort of institutions that desperately need to be created, sustained, and proliferated in a time when critical thought is very much being driven from the academy, and maybe we might even say is being increasingly marginalized on the left. I also want to thank Philip and others for inviting me and supporting my work. I was actually asked to talk about fetishism at the first Red May, and today I'm going to talk about my book, Social Constitution and Fetishistic Social Domination, and Marx, Lukács, Adorno, and Lefebvre, which is based on a PhD thesis that I completed 3 years before the first Red May that I began in 2007. Now, I raise these points not to show you how long it took me to finish the book, but to point to how I think its roots are in a research program that is perhaps less prominent today, but which I think is thankfully still sort of being continued and developed and advanced. And my claim is that this book, my book, is indicative of an early moment of what people now call the Marx revival, or what it was called in this new book, Marx in America, the Fourth Marx Boom. And this is when people sort of turned to Marx in the immediate aftermath of the 2007 crisis. I think you might say to try and understand how pervasively society was dominated by the logic of capital, or we might even say the process of capitalist accumulation. And this approach sort of re-examined certain categories of Marx or Marxist figures in new ways to understand the extent to which the logic of capital, or maybe even more specifically, the logic of capitalist crisis, linked society together in order to overcome it. Now, I think, we might say in recent years that this approach has been superseded by one that still tries to understand the relationship between capital accumulation and capitalist society, but I think does so in a slightly different way that it maybe is perhaps underappreciated. And that is to sort of focus on the extent to which the market dominates the activities that take place in other areas of society, which are nonetheless appropriated by the market. Now, I'm saying this, right, not to sort of draw some sort of orthodox line. And I want to make it clear that I consider the sort of people who've developed this approach to be comrades, and, acknowledge that their work is a very sort of important advance over economistic interpretations of Marxism. But at the same time, I do find some weaknesses in this newer conception of capitalist society and domination. And that, I think, has to do with, in a sense, conceiving of the market as sort of a fully differentiated sphere, which then tends to lead to theories that overlook sort of how subjects and subjectivity in other parts of society are dominated by this process of capital accumulation. More recently, other people have turned to new Marxist figures to criticize sort of this bogeyman of Western Marxism, and especially the Frankfurt School for sort of promulgating a sort of utopianism that it's argued serves the interests of the American empire. Now, I think this criticism is kind of, well, to be honest, I think it's kind of silly. And that, like the category of Western Marxism itself, which it doesn't really examine and extend, and instead sort of extends to figures who aren't really even Marxist. Both the category of Western Marxism and this approach, I think, prevent us from drawing insights from figures, who are placed within this tradition of Western Marxism, and seeing how maybe they can, help us understand our present moment. In other words, right, I hope this book is timely and cuts against these grains in two important ways. In the first place, it focuses on what I call Marx's theory of the fetish, not as a theory of market domination of price signals, but as a theory of social constitution and fetishistic social domination. And in the second place, it focuses on how central figures in Western Marxism, Lukács, Adorno, and Lefebvre, interpreted Marx's theory of the fetish and attempted to extend it to account for fetishistic domination in areas of society that Marx did not get to himself. So this means that for the most part, the book is concerned with differentiating my focus on the theory of the fetish from different approaches to fetishism, and then reconstructing these figures' social theory on this basis. I'm just going to provide sort of a very, hopefully concise overview. So in distinction to those who interpret fetishism as either a theory of false consciousness that conceives of fetishism as falsely believing commodities have value, when that value, the value of commodities was in fact created by labor, or who conceive of fetishism as a theory of alienation, which then sees fetishism in terms of a thing that is estranged from the essential human activities that create it, or those who conceive of fetishism as reification, or Lukácsian reification more specifically, which sees fetishism as a thing that mystifies the relations that create it. I argue that the theory of the fetish is a theory of social constitution and fetishistic social domination. I define social constitution as an account of how society or entities that are characteristic of society are created by social relations. I define fetishistic social domination as a theory of how capitalistic social relations create an autonomous, supra-individual, and inverted type of domination that transforms individuals in these relations into bearers of domination, compelling the reproduction of these relations. So now I'm going to give a brief account of sort of how I interpret this in each of these figures. When it comes to Marx, I argue that Marx's theory of the fetish provides an account of the social constitution and fetishistic social domination of the forms of value by grounding his form analysis on how social relations that are mediated by things are necessarily manifest in the personification of things and the transformation of persons into things. This means that in the second place, I argue that Marx's notion of what I call fetish characteristic properties describes the autonomous and personified objective and socio-natural properties of sensuous, supersensible things as bearers of value, which dominate individuals as personifications of economic categories and the social relations that compose them. Finally, in the third place, I sort of attempt to show or reconstruct that this account of Marx's is unfolded throughout capital, from the commodities through money, capital, and valorization in Volume 1, culminating in the Trinity formula in Volume 3. And that in the course of this presentation, these fetish characteristic properties become more autonomous at the same time as their domination of production and distribution and individuals in the class relations become more concrete. My interpretation of Lukács is based on an interpretation of arguing that his interpretation of commodity fetishism synthesizes sort of a Hegelian classical Marxist interpretation of fetishism and neo-Kantian aspects of his thought. And in so doing, what he provides is an account of the constitution and constituent fetishistic social domination of what I call dominating social mystification of reified totality. And I trace sort of how he extends this, beyond Marx's analysis to other areas of the economy. When it comes to Adorno, I show how Adorno's later work interprets Marx's theory of fetishism as what I call the fetishistic properties of the exchange abstraction, wherein class antagonistic production for exchange creates an abstraction that grants commodities with socially objective properties that dominate individuals as character masks. I then show how Adorno fuses this interpretation of Marx with Hegel differentiates himself from Lukács, and I reconstruct the role that the exchange abstraction plays in his critical theory of the objective and subjective moments of late capitalist society. Then I turn to Lefebvre, and I show how he conceives of the fetish as a concrete abstraction, which intervenes but does not entirely determine social life. And I show how this conception of fetishistic concrete abstraction is something, that sort of can be found throughout his work, from the critique of everyday life through his work on cities to the production of space, and how he uses this theory to sort of try to talk about how these abstract types of domination sort of intervene in but do not entirely determine social life. The conclusion then turns to considering the importance of these interpretations for scholarship on these figures and sort of the larger question of critical theory. In general, I sort of argue I've provided a new interpretation of these figures, but I also try to argue that it's important to focus on the fetish in distinction to notions of alienation and reification. Because I argue, right, that notions of alienation tend to conceive of domination in terms of humans somehow being dehumanized by a process that alienates them from their human nature, which leads to attempts to reassert, supplement, and offer a new perspective or further develop this notion of human nature that is being dehumanized. And this moves away from focusing on sort of the process that dominates people. Reification sort of looks at the other side of the coin, right? It tends to see domination in terms of the transformation of social processes into illusory things, or the instrumental reason induced by these false appearances. And this leads to focusing on reasserting, supplanting, or developing new perspectives on things, right? Or the types of reason that they induce. So in other words, alienation as domination tends to focus on the subject as a problem of human nature, or what is being dominated, and theories of reification on the object as a problem of thingification, or what is dominating, right? And in so doing, I think they both fall behind the theory of the fetish, if you think of it as a theory of social constitution and fetishistic social domination, because in my view, such a theory aims to provide an objective and subjective social theory of why and how social relations create, right, this supra-individual, autonomous, and inverted dynamic of social domination that compels and maims individuals as character masks in the social relations that constituted this dynamic, leading to its perpetuation. In other words, the focus is on social relations and social dynamics of objectivity and subjectivity. Yet, as I further argue, neither of these figures provide such a theory of their own. So while I think this perspective is missing in more prominent contemporary work on capitalism and domination, right? And I think, this is one important way we might turn to these figures associated with Western Marxism and draw on their insights. I'm not arguing any of them are sufficient on their own, right? Nor is my work, which is why I think the other work being discussed by Andy, right, Amy and Naima and Chris and other people's work is so important, because I really see it as, very important and interesting contributions to this sort of research program that I try to examine and also place my work in some way. So thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Chris. I just want to echo Chris's thanks to the Red May Collective and to Phil Wallsetter especially for their amazing and long-running work now. Thank you very much to Chris Nealon for generously moderating this panel as well. Appreciate you very much. And thanks, Chris, for outlining your book so clearly. I really see my own book as building on the methods that you bring out there. So I hope this talk will follow along nicely from yours. Rather than offering a more general summary of the interventions of the new book Behind Our Backs, which I've done elsewhere online, I thought I'd use this gathering of friends as a chance to talk about what I hope it has to offer for what we could call a value theory of difference, or we could call it something else, but I'll call it that for now, a value theory of difference. And I want to emphasize how much these parts of the book, of my book, are building on other feminist interventions that, even when celebrated, are still somewhat sidelined into the much denigrated category of the woman question, despite the fact that their critique is a critique of the social whole and its total reproduction. Why do barely any Marxist men work on feminism? I barely need to answer that question. So I'm thinking specifically of the feminist essays and arguments of Marxists like Rosemary Hennessy, Beverly Best, Kay Gabriel, and Marina Vishmit, as well as the theoretical interventions of those I'm calling feminized poets in the book, all of whom explain why there are 0 degrees of separation between sexual liberation and class struggle. Like women, poetry has often been put forth as a celebration of particulars. But I argue in the book that, in fact, we can read in a lot of feminized poetry an appeal to abstraction and a desire for a view of the whole, otherwise foreclosed by capital's self-representations. Rather than confirming a set of gendered properties often attributed to lyric poetry in the feminist tradition, embodiment, plenitude, immediacy, unknowingness, authenticity, or something like, in Vishmit's words, the pseudo-concreteness that often accompanies theoretical projects intolerant of the real abstraction that organizes contemporary social life. As opposed to this, these poems manipulate form, language, and movement to register dialectical contradictions so that we might grasp them for a moment. They point to why we might need to be better dialectical readers of vernacular, sensory, experimental, anarchist, or otherwise feminized cultural forms and popular culture, if we're to be sensitized to what these forms have to tell us about sex and gender, to what they have to say about the discrepancy between capital's social forms of appearance and its singular inner logic and movement, where, as Best shows us, value dissimulates itself from the social forms it produces and determines. And social form is also important for this book about poetry because it gets us thinking about form and formlessness. With the emergence of social reproduction theory, there's been a resurgence of interest in Marxist feminism. But in the book, I suggest that what's been missed in these discussions is the way that Marxist feminists in the 1970s suggested an approach that takes neither the wage form nor reification as its primary basis for a critique of capitalist totality. Instead, the hidden abode of reproduction provides a vantage from which to critique gender not as an ideological problem to be solved by consciousness raising, nor as a static categorical difference between waged and unwaged labour, but as social form. And part of what's so radical about early Marxist feminist texts, such as Silvia Federici's Wages Against Housework, therefore, is that the method they suggest for theorising the dialectical relationships between concrete activities and the abstraction of gender begins not with the commodity, the wage, nor the labourer, but with the formless histories and negative relations obscured by these forms of appearance. So this is a non-deterministic way of systematically accounting for capital's totalizing movement, the way it draws all it can into its orbit and throws off whatever can't be made value productive. Behind Our Backs, then, argues that a wide array of poets working today are writing about these obscured relations between abstraction and difference, between an entire society and a variety of entirely specific social determinations. Importantly, they're writing both about capitalist abstraction itself as something sensed but not cognized, and they're writing from the position of the underside of abstraction. What might be incompletely comprehended as negative affect can thus be understood as a way of structuring form and feeling so as to capture not only an experience of the poet's immediate surround, which would be legible as sociable, but an experience of the not quite here and not only now, a sensitivity to totality that unfolds beyond the identificatory logic of conceptual thought. So, to put it slightly differently, my claim is that feminized poetry from North America provides a pretty radical story of capitalism as a total system when it links the hidden abodes of social reproduction to the inner bonds of capital's logic. And this way of reading it marks the difference between a simple notion of the structural and an understanding of social forms in motion. Indeed, this is a way of responding to the problem that in capitalism, social relationships between labour activities appear as social relationships between things, between commodities. This representational problem is complicated by the fact that, as Marx shows us, these social relationships between things appear to producers as what they are. There's no illusion involved at this level, because in capitalism, people don't coordinate their labour or have direct social relationships. Rather, our social relationships really are mediated by things called commodities. Frederick Jameson connects this insight to the Hegelian claim for the reality of the appearance, to argue that capitalist representations do not belie an obscured systemic poison to which we might awaken. Rather, they constitute our reality. But to say that this world of appearances is objectively real is not to say that the truth of capital lies obviously before us. Rather, it's to point out that a different mode of interpretation is required, one that grasps the double character of social forms themselves. In this way, feminized poetry helps us to see how capitalist abstraction becomes real, not by suddenly becoming a thing, a commodity, a woman, a subject per se, but by coercing participation in a whole process that constantly discards and returns to those things. The insight that the reality of capitalism is not concealed by commodity fetishism, but is in fact perversely expressed by it, can help to explain why subjective experiences of this system can be so difficult to interpret. The task of the critic, we find, is not to disabuse readers of false consciousness, as Chris was saying, but nor is it to diagnose a case of what Louis Althusser called the misrecognized identification with capital's narratives, as I think Chris also argues. Rather, a value theory working with Marxist feminism can work in the service of a feminist method of reading dialectically, a method attuned to the highly ambivalent and dialectical ways in which capitalist subjects might identify. And identifies in scare quotes too. And so when literary texts engage the dialectics of aesthetic experience to think about the relation between sense perception and a total system in this way, they are themselves doing a type of theorizing. So let me very briefly gesture to a couple of methods the book elaborates to think about that. And the first draws on Rosemary Hennessy's Marxian reworking of the concept of second skin, which she borrows from J. Prosser, but brilliantly turns into a dialectical device. In her 2013 book, Fires on the Border, Hennessy argues that the cultural vehicle of validated masculine and degraded feminine significations mediates a disposable labour force in which, quote, all subjects who transgress this prescribed distribution of gendered bodies are feminized, whether they are men or women, end quote. Writing about maquiladora workers in Nuevo Laredo, which is a Mexican city close to the US border, Hennessy offers an account of the determinate relationship between value and the gender-sex binary. Insisting on the embodied and not purely discursive aspects of identity formation, she describes the brutal treatment to which maquiladora workers are subjected, from pills to force them to work for days without sleep, to homophobic bullying. And she draws on Prosser's concept of a second skin to describe these practices as feminizing operations. For Prosser, the concept of a second skin offers a way to narrate trans experiences of a second material body that's subject to dominant social ascriptions, experiences which may be contrasted to a more personally felt sense of gendered embodiment. But in transposing the concept of a second skin to her analysis of the exploitation of maquiladora workers, Hennessy finds a way to connect both the embodied and discursive dimensions of feminized subjecthood to Marx's category of surplus value. In doing so, she theorizes value's relationship both to an embodied subject who can be disproportionately exploited, a subject who physically and mentally, quote, forfeits more of themselves in the labor relations that produce capital, end quote, and value's relationship to the cultural impress of the sign of feminization. In her words, quote, a feminized second skin folded into the conditions of exploitation, which is legitimized by the cultural values circulating outside the factory. In Hennessy's hands, then, second skin becomes a dialectical device that helps to flesh out the meaning of terms like socially binding and form determining, enabling us to see how the capitalist strategy of lowering the price of feminized labor reproduces a materially and discursively feminized subject, a form of appearance that, not insignificantly, conjoins two generalized social abstractions called gender and sex, and does so in part through another one called race. This approach endeavours to get to the heart of the question of how categories come into social being in the first place, as our esteemed moderator, Chris Nealon, puts it. And this leads me to the second useful method I want to highlight, which has to do with Marx's account of social categories in Capital Volume 3 and the social category of cisgender. In Capital 3, Marx describes three social categories: the capitalist class, the landowning class, and the working class, as social forms of appearance tied by property relations to capital's ostensible sources of revenue, capital, land, and labour, where these latter three categories comprise the Trinity formula, the three sources of revenue presented by Adam Smith. What we might think of as the three base social classes, then, are classes embodied and reproduced by actual people who are either capitalists, landowners, or proletarians. But, as we know, these categories are further differentiated, most obviously along lines of gender and race. Herein lies a crucial connection, I'd argue, between Marx's critique of value and recent developments in transfeminism, where we find a renewed focus on gendered categories of identity as social abstractions that, in part, just in part, emerges from queer theory's long-standing critique of identity, and especially from its disarticulating work to reveal how the richest junctures in sexual and kinship relations aren't the ones where everything means the same thing, as Eve Sedgwick put it. To be sure, this queer negativity informs Emma Heaney's critique of the ideology of cisgender, which employs the effective tactic of simply redescribing its object. And here's a short quote from Emma Heaney's, a talk by Emma Heaney. We're used to thinking of cisness as an identity. One is cis if one is not trans, one has a cis body if one doesn't have a trans body. But cisness is more accurately understood as the ideology that sorts us into these two categories. Cisness is the belief that, for almost everyone, one or another set of qualities adhere to our bodies at birth based on the appearance of our genitals, either at or before birth with imaging technology. Heaney's refusal of the logic of cisness relies on the idea of sex and gender as distributional categories, and sex as a mediating technology. We might say that the social classes of capitalist, landowner, and proletarian are helpful analytical concepts here then, because they represent what Marx might call the thinnest social identities. We can tie each of them respectively to three corresponding forms of appearance, the supposed revenue sources of capital, land, and labour. The distributional categories of gender and sex, on the other hand, arise from a more complex array of social arrangements, laws, and customs. In her edited collection, Feminism Against Cisness, Heaney offers a clarifying example of this fact when she describes how the trans-feminist activist Marsha P. Johnson's identification with her mother, a, quote, strong black woman, provided the ground for her sex identification. Importantly for Heaney, Johnson's account of her identification with womanhood is closely connected to the varieties of feminized labour that she saw her mother performing: washing, ironing, cooking, sewing, and so on. Johnson's account of sex identification thereby offers an example of, quote, one material way in which the abstraction called sex materializes in the consciousness of individuals, both for those whom we call cis and those whom we call trans, end quote. What better way to highlight the impersonal, economic dimensions of sexual difference than by pointing to the perpetual and repeated actions that made Johnson's mother into a woman and subsequently provided a site of affinity for Johnson to develop her own reflexively social sense of sex identity. In this case, quote, an identity born of skill transmission. In this vein, Behind Our Backs tries to provide an account of the becoming concrete of capital's abstractions, a task aided by our reading of the non-conceptual aspects of feminized poetry and our understanding of what happens when we're carried along by aesthetic works that convey a sense of capital's various mediations of gender. Rather than unveiling an underlying structure in the kind of big reveal that has come to caricature modes of paranoid or diagnostic decoding, feminized poetries offer us dynamic ways to think about the recompositions of gender as they toggle sensory and intuitive forms of perception to larger rhythms and systems. What, at different points in the book, and drawing on the language of other critics, I refer to as hidden abodes, aching gaps, elsewheres, and polytemporal pacts, are poets' attempts to write that history and to do so in a way that conveys both its immediate reality and its non-identity. So to finish by mentioning just a couple of examples of how these poets go about that task. Kay Gabriel's book, A Queen in Bucks County, makes a series of very cunning metaphorical substitutions to show us how the trans body, like all bodies, is both real and not real, a phenomenological and capitalist reality perennially reconstituted by capitalism's heres and elsewheres in a series of constitutive moments. That means that the Queen in Bucks County is not realized in any single erotics or identity, but instead unmasks the artifice of all social relations in capitalism. Or to give another example from the book, the Anishinaabe poet Marie Ann Hart Baker uses various lyrical strategies, including a number of jokes, to deliberately meld significations of race, gender, and class to suggest their imminent co-constitution. Her work highlights the reproduction of a version of indigeneity as a racial category invented by settlers, pointing to the way that capital picks up on existing differences and fills them with its own content. In this way, her work challenges Althusserian models of structural causality and Marxist feminist unitary theories alike. But you don't have to go to poetry for this. These kinds of ingenious experiments are everywhere in feminized, queer, and trans popular and working class culture. But I do think that poetry has some special tools at its disposal for doing this kind of theory. And indeed, the power of the cognitive yet non-conceptual character of poetry to draw the subject into its internal dynamics is particularly important for Sian Nye, who, building on Sherry Weber Nicholson's reading of Adorno, underlines that, quote, the enigmatic muteness of poetry is thus linked not just to its refusal of communicative language, but to its turn toward a mimesis that involves the subject in a silent internal tracing of the work's articulations, assimilating herself to the object's form. Because these poems attend to experiences of simultaneously abstract and concrete relations, their mimetic action not only registers the formal characteristics of gendering processes as they're lived and felt on both highly personal and all too disinterested scales, but they do so in a way that allows us extra conceptual access to that process. Thus, the book aims to show how what Marina Vishmet has called a rationality premised on sensuous non-knowledge, or a form of experiential perception that cannot be resolved into concepts, is made possible in these works, as well as how this non-knowledge may help to show, often with painful specificity, how gender and sex are inextricably bound up in racial domination and the reproduction of class relations. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Amy. That was fantastic. I'm still like in the middle of taking notes on those two presentations that came before us. But we'll get started here. I'm really happy and honored to be here. I've spent all month listening to really incredible and really helpful presentations. I've been thinking about Kieran's reporting from Minneapolis. There was a great panel on Wednesday that spoke really beautifully to the work we're trying to do with Marxist thought, and so many others that have really informed my thinking and influenced the way I'm going to frame my remarks today. I also want to say congratulations and thank you to Philip for organizing this fantastic series for so long, and to John and Chris, all the Chris's we have in the room today, for making this possible. And everybody should go and read Chris O and Amy's books, which are just so unbelievably good. So Andy and I co-wrote this article called Value, Dissociation and Racial Form out of a set of shared interests in pre-capitalist and early capitalist social formations, in value dissociation and differential unemployment, and in race and racialization under capitalism. But we also have different areas of expertise. So what I'll do is lay out my sense of the project, where I was coming from, try to get at why I think it's relevant to the struggle, because it's not always self-evident, even to me, why we as Marxists would want to spend so much time on processes of abstraction that we are presumably trying to get away from. So I'll talk about some of the debates between Marxism and Black studies, the stakes of the argument, and a quick preview of our theoretical intervention. And then Andy is going to do some more detailed work on value dissociation and the unproductive sphere. So the first thing I'll say is that there's a long-standing tension between Marxism and Black studies, most famously exemplified in Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism, which rewrites the Black radical tradition as fundamentally or even ontologically distinct from so-called Western Marxism. And Chris, in his presentation, talked a little bit about the limitations of that term. But since Robinson's book came out, a lot of thinkers and writers in Black studies have sought to distance their discipline theoretically, philosophically, and politically from Marxism. And Cedric Johnson also touched a little bit on this yesterday. And I think he put it really brilliantly by saying that this sort of quotidian assumption that Marx never talked about race, which you come up against over and over again in various grad seminars, classrooms, and activist spaces, is a way for people to avoid seriously engaging the struggle. And those are like pretty precisely the stakes for me. I think we need to bridge the gap that exists between the perception of Marxism as a theory of white class struggle and what it actually entails, which is the pursuit of freedom. So part of what we're trying to do in this essay is to overcome that aporia while also taking seriously critiques from people like Robinson, Denise Ferreira da Silva, and Fred Moten regarding Marxism's occasionally inadequate theorizations of raciality, which is also very deeply related to what Amy was saying about the sort of sidelining of feminist thought, right? So for the sake of clarity and at the slight risk of schematization, I would identify three key components of the Black Studies critique. So one is what I've already mentioned. We have just this observation of the lack of racial theory in so-called Western Marxism, which I think is a true observation, right? That Marx and Lenin mention race. They are fierce abolitionists. They talk about it. They don't theorize it as a philosophical problem. So, it's far less true that there's no racial Marxism. That's not really true anymore, but it once was. And for the most part, Marxist thinking about race still has to be something of an extrapolation, philosophically speaking. And as Amy was saying, we might think of it of racial differentiation as a kind of further differentiation beyond the classes that comprise the Trinity formula. So that's one with about 1 million caveats in there. Two, coming from Black Studies, we have the emphasis on wage labor as the most fundamental site of capitalist exploitation, and the necessarily related presumption of the proletarian factory worker as the revolutionary subject under capitalism, which of course, it doesn't allow you to think of slave revolts as really significant revolutionary moments. And the third point is a historical one that is also occasionally philosophical. A lot of writers and thinkers are going to say, well, Blackness clearly precedes the advent of capitalism in the early modern period, so it doesn't really make logical sense to theorize racial subjugation as a sort of consequence or invention of capitalism. So the article attempts to address all three of these points by theorizing Blackness in relation to the contradictory unity of the productive and unproductive spheres and the systemic necessity under capitalism of a, quote, value-dissociated existence. Our starting point was to understand Blackness as A, representationally and ideologically contingent with respect to value relations, and B, historically and differentially linked to slavery and unemployment. In this way, we diverge from both an account like Moishe Postone's anti-Semitism essay, which posits a sort of one-to-one correlation between categories of value and ideological features of a particular racial makeup. In the case of that essay, it would be Jewishness. We also differ from an account like Da Silva's, which posits anti-Blackness as the discursively constituted governing principle of modernity. And Da Silva's account is also emblematic of a strain in Black studies, which theorizes Blackness as something like excess or externality. And I think the other side of that coin is Blackness as absolute negativity, which you see in Afro-pessimism. So how do we, as Marxists, take seriously the element of truth in those arguments without veering into a kind of Foucauldian post-structuralism? Once again, risking reduction for the sake of clarity, we know that Blackness preceded capitalism as a metric of difference. The early modern Europeans were using it primarily to designate territorial distinctions. So rather than Blackness as an abstract category, we had the related categories of Moor and Blackamoor, referring to the populations of North and Central Africa. We also know that capitalism's historical movement involves the subsumption of everything outside of itself, the assimilation of human difference into abstract economic domination. In the case of Blackness, this assimilation meant transforming a category previously linked to to a particular religious or territorial designation into an abstract representational form, such that it no longer mattered where you were from or what religion you practiced. If you were Black, you could be enslaved. So Blackness under capitalism becomes fundamentally linked to wagelessness as slavery rather than Africanness necessarily. But another key point of the article is that this doesn't happen absolutely or necessarily, nor does it imply ontological fixity. It is never the case that Blackness becomes an invariant social category entirely reducible to a particular class or a particular sphere of economic relations. Rather, it becomes a social form defined by differential exclusion from civil society, from the bourgeois class, from knowledge production, and from the freedom, however ambivalent, of the waged laborer. This exclusion is never empirically or sociologically absolute, nor is it necessary with respect to capitalism's continued functioning. And understanding this partiality, this contingency, this particular kind of inequality is, to my mind, a precondition for overcoming the various mystifications that would seek to maintain the ideological separation of the Black worker from the Latinx farm worker, from the white factory hand, from the unpaid domestic laborer, and so on and so forth. So I'll leave my section of the talk there and turn it over to Andy for an elaboration on what we mean by the unproductive sphere.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you, Naima. And also echoing all of my co-panelists' various thank yous and gratitudes, especially to Philip and John for your truly heroic ongoing work and your generosity in putting together this wonderful Red May series. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to speak with and present alongside this roster of panelists and friends. Okay, so as Naima kind of set me up, I'm going to be talking about a kind of maybe more abstract sort of account of this unproductive sphere that is an important part of our paper's sort of key argument or intervention. So in this co-authored paper with Naima and in my current work more generally, I've been trying to develop a more robust account of what Naima and I are calling here the unproductive sphere, similar to what Roswitha Schultz has called value dissociation. So one of our broader arguments is that a proper conceptualization of these phenomena will sort of turn out to prove useful or essential as a mediating term that so far has been lacking in Marxist theories of so-called form determination. In other words, how we get from the abstract invariant categories of bourgeois exchange in Marx's Capital to an adequate theoretical account of the various historical forms of social difference, oppression, and so on that have characterized capitalism's longue durée. So our sort of approach here, in keeping with Marx's account in Capital, is that we take bourgeois exchange relations to be characterized, as I was saying, by invariant logical presuppositions. Some of these might include a generalized context of generalized satisfaction of needs by commodity production, private property and labor and means of production. And with those key elements, the necessity of determining and coordinating the concrete activities required for society as a whole to reproduce itself will tend to occur through the commensuration of these various forms of concrete activity via the objective abstractions of socially necessary labor time. So Marx's Capital demonstrates how these basic logical presuppositions of bourgeois exchange must manifest in particular, contradictory, and mystified forms as capitalism's logic fully unfolds through its historical development and global generalization. One of our core claims, though, is that, however, particular ideologies of social difference, gender, sexuality, race, nationality, and so on, considered both as oppressive logics of differentiating exclusion, but we could also think of them as differentiating inclusionary logics of care, solidarity, reproduction, organizational inclusion, etc. These particular ideologies are not presupposed in their particular shape at the level of bourgeois social relations invariant logical presuppositions and their invariant entailments. One could take a sort of speculative sci-fi example or something. One could imagine a species of non-human entities who, for example, asexually reproduce, exhibit no forms of visibly legible bodily difference. In other words, a capitalism adopted by a species for whom sexism or racism cannot exist in anything like our usual conventional sense. One could imagine a capitalism like that, with sort of agents like that. But one could not imagine a capitalism here or in any hypothetical reality that wouldn't be characterized by surplus value, the systemic imperative of capital accumulation, equalization of profit rate across sectors of production, and so on. Lacking any of those determinants, that is simply not capitalism, right? However, we argue that ideologies of social difference in general, in some form, are necessarily entailed by the invariant presuppositions of capitalism. We argue that ideologies of social difference in capitalism are to be understood as systemically necessitated, functionalized, and reproduced in capitalism, primarily by the dynamics of the unproductive sphere or value association. So in this respect, Naima and I, as well as I think many of our co-panelists, it's fair to say, have been very influenced by Beverly Best's recent work on Capital Volume 3, in which she emphasizes that Capital Volume 3 is best understood as a theory of ideology. So in Capital 3, in this sense, ideology refers to a local, efficacious form of practical understanding that is nevertheless in itself a misrepresentation of the essential logical and total systemic determinants of value relations. So the key examples in Capital 3 are things like price, rent, interest, wage, labor, the three great classes of the Trinity formula. These are all ideological forms in this sense. And so when we say that either these sort of more recognizable forms from Volume 3 or these forms of social difference that we are trying to theorize, to say that they are ideological is therefore, in this Marxist sense, precisely not to say that these are epiphenomenal, merely reflective or superstructural. It's to say that they are integral and determinative with respect to the total shape of capitalist social relations, distribution of value, and things like this. For example, one could say, in this regard, the falling rate of profit, this very significant total systemic determination of capitalism, really is an effect of ideology in Marx's account, in the sense of there is a separation between, say, the generalized imperative of capital in general to increase the rate of surplus value and the ideological competition on profit and cost price that capitalists participate in, equalization of profit rate across sectors, etc., that then contradicts and countervails and mystifies that general imperative. Whereas the first three volumes of Capital are mostly concerned with elaborating how these specific ideological forms are generated and function within the productive sphere, that is, the relations of capital's realization and valorization, we argue that in capitalism, racial representation and other ideologies of social difference are made possible rather by value dissociation or the necessity of the unproductive sphere, and its forms of social management. So by this, we mean all the relations that serve either to externally redistribute the revenues of the productive sphere or to differentiate access to the productive sphere in a manner that becomes increasingly expansive and integral to the reproduction of capitalist society as a whole, as it historically develops. So in this sense, our project involves a speculative extension of the 3 volumes of Capital, going towards the derivation of the relations of what Marx called the state and the unproductive classes, which Marx said in the Grundrisse, he projected that a treatment of the state and the unproductive classes would have to be reserved for a subsequent volume following the stage of the analysis that he eventually reached in Capital 3, the derivation of the Trinity formula and the 3 great social classes, as he calls them. To get into this question of the dynamics that generate the unproductive sphere, readers of Capital Volume 1 will probably remember that Marx calls the dynamic, which necessitates the creation of the reserve army of labor, the unemployed, and for us, it necessitates the unproductive sphere. He calls this the general law of capitalist accumulation. And so to quickly sketch this, essentially, there's a general compulsion on each individual capital in the context of intercapitalist competition to increase the rate of surplus value. And this tends to mandate the introduction of technical machinery to increase productivity. This in turn tends to increase the proportion of total capital invested in constant capital relative to capital paid on wages. Increase this proportion system-wide, even as the total mass of commodities to be sold increases. So in other words, this means that there's a total tendency for ever fewer workers being needed per capital input, while an ever larger population can be sustained by the increasing mass of commodities produced, which means that the realization of the value of this expanding mass of commodities, which is a condition for the expanded reproduction of capital as a whole, requires an increase in consumption as a whole. But this cannot be realized solely by increasing the consumption levels of the presently employed wage workers in industry, not only because of the contingent coordination problems of individual capitals, but because at the level of the logic of the total system, an increase in total wage value to the extent necessary to realize all of this consumption would essentially be zero sum for total capital, insofar as that would, it's trying to increase the general rate of surplus value. And so then this would just directly countervail that if this was answered by transfers back to working class consumption employed in the productive sphere. So insofar as this total social surplus cannot be realized or reinvested productively, it must be consumed non-productively, i.e. not reinvested as capital or going into the reproduction of the presently employed proletariat. So this is what generates the dynamics of the unproductive sphere, which facilitates the transfer of a portion of total revenues from the productive, i.e. capital valorizing sphere, to populations within capitalist society in a manner not directly mediated by this relationship between labor and capital proper to the productive sphere. Okay, so here's where our argument gets into this question of kind of invariance and possibility, this next leap in form determination, what that means for an account of ideology or social form determination. So once we pass over into this analysis of, or this derivation of the unproductive sphere, it becomes especially important to insist on a sort of divergence or non-identity between the imperatives that are entailed necessarily by values logic and the mere possibility of the particular forms that answer these imperatives. So because the relations of the unproductive sphere are formally external to the valorization process, even as they are conditioned at least partly as a functional response to its imperatives, analysis of these variant possible ideological forms of the unproductive sphere cannot be grounded on any sort of purported homology to the structure of that process. And furthermore, from the perspective of the abstract logic of capital accumulation and its management, the sort of value composition of the shape of the prices of capital's expanded reproduction at any particular time, from that perspective, any further determination of the unproductive sphere is essentially negative and must be essentially negative. It has to be a determination basically of how an internal barrier to the expanded reproduction of capital at the level of capital's logic, which is irresolvable within the formal sphere of capital's valorization, instead has to exert a negative pressure on social relations outside those relations of valorization. calling on society in turn with some altogether different form of social organization and ideological justification exert an external negative force on the sort of otherwise what would be the spontaneous arrangement of capital labor relations internal to this productive sphere. It basically calls forth the unproductive sphere to negatively discipline the imminent crisis of the spontaneous dynamics of the productive sphere. So as a category of separation then, with respect to these relations, the unproductive sphere includes a variety of social positions we may be accustomed to regarding as historically particular and sociologically heterogeneous. One could think of the impoverished unemployed supported by state welfare and personal and civil social philanthropy, or those who sustain themselves providing services for personal consumption rather than selling their labor power. You can think of servants, housewives. Marx's favorite example is the Pope. And those who derive their income from their employment for state services, such as politicians, state employees, police, military. So evidently here we're addressing phenomena which are not necessarily presupposed in sort of the abstract logic of value, which have not appeared and need not necessarily appear in all capitalist periods and regions, whether historical or possible, and whose particular historical forms are differentiated by particular ideologies of social difference. And so here, again, we can think of these examples of differential exclusion from regular wage and capital relations with respect to race, gender, nationality, etc. The way state and civil society can variously exercise these differentiations, both de jure and de facto. One can also think of ideologies that justify the particular form and scale of state redistribution of the productive sphere's revenues. So welfare service or state fund qualifications, the scale and type of those redistributions and services. So as a final note here, and with these examples, it becomes clear why it's important not to think of the ideological forms generated by value dissociation as designating only a separate set of individuals or a distinct form of revenue transfer, but is rather something that is inextricably imbricated in the total shape and even in the total shape of value relations, but even as something that directly inflects certain value relations themselves. So one can think of, for example, redlining as a state policy or informal social practice. This clearly determines formal exchange and may directly affect employees and capitalists of the productive sphere as much as, say, the wageless, despite being in no way given in the concept of exchange per se. One can also think here of these complex examples of, say, like state subsidies to particular sectors, in which some economists theorize as hidden unemployment, right? If the state decides to actually artificially make it so that an industry, a certain productivity increasing innovation is not introduced, and therefore effectively subsidizes a sector of employment. In effect, there's an analogy here between that simply being a kind of form of hidden unemployment, despite the fact that it appears to take a form of spontaneously socially demanded wage labor, right? So here maybe to do a brief philosophical aside, calling back to maybe the wonderful panel a couple days ago, I think the Hegel smiling at the end of the road panel. One of the implications for argument is that we can start to think now of how the antinomy that Gillian Rose calls Hegel contra sociology, this question of whether society ought to be interpreted speculatively or dialectically as the objective concept, right? Or reflectively as a collection of transient sociological and ideological phenomena, a sort of mass of social facts. This kind of opposition in theoretical thought or interpretive reflection or whatever you would like to call it this can be grounded not as a primarily methodological problem, but as an expression or symptom of the objective coexistence of the productive and unproductive spheres in this regard. Because both of these spheres are actualized and practically sort of intertwined at every social level, social interpretation can't take either of these spheres to be unilaterally determinative with respect to any particular interpretive social object. I'm going to, I'm going to skip elaborating that a bit further for the sake of time. So I guess drawing close to the close here, we think that one thing that recommends this account is the way that it allows us to avoid various theoretical and political dead ends of a more vulgar or formalistic Marxist approach to ideologies of social difference or oppression. So as I mentioned before, we can avoid this question of that these forms are not epiphenomenal, they're not superstructural in a kind of vaguely reflectionist sense. They're not mere pre-capitalist remnants. They're not merely psychological prejudices that have aggregate effects. They're not, a in-group, out-group tendency in human nature or anything like this. And maybe a final sort of upshot in closing, maybe an upshot of this account that's more political and organizational rather than philosophical or methodological. One upshot would be that this helps us practically and politically orient ourselves in such a way as left intellectuals and organizers, in such a way that we do not remain analytically bound to possibly misrecognizing new forms of social differentiation as merely reiterations of the essentially same old forms, or conversely, that we don't remain bound to misrecognizing the passing away of older forms of social domination within capitalism as implying a kind of progress possible within capitalism toward the passing away of oppressive social differentiation in general. So as our account would suggest, some instantiation of these forms must always remain with us as a systemic necessity as long as global capitalist relations remain in place. So this would be maybe a totalizing an internationalist sort of implication of the account. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody. Can you all hear me okay? I just want to make sure my mic is back on. And of course, I'm going to ask you all to be audio on in just a second. I thought while we maybe wait for comments in the chat, if there are any, Chris P. will forward them to me. I would take a step back and think about the panel as a whole, and maybe begin by thinking about the title of the panel, or the part of the title that was about Marxism and social form, and think just a minute about the different things you all have helped us maybe get clearer on about what something like social form might mean for Marxists or opponents of capital who are reading Marx. And so it seemed to me that there's different ways we can think about it. I mean, for everybody on the call, I'm pretty sure is a lot younger than me, and more of you, I think, were shaped by the 2008 crisis in your youth than I was. Though I've been riding alongside the theoretical currents that have become so much stronger since then, and I think that something about that period of crisis and militancy gave folks a way to do something that, say, a Frederick Jameson wanted to do in the 80s, but it sounded like a tough sell, which is like, I'm a pluralist, Freud's cool, anti-racist language and stuff, politics and theory are cool, feminism is cool, but Marxism is the kind of undergirding of all of that. Like, let's just be honest about that. And, that, however true that might be in whatever senses that might be true, that's like a tough sell when you put it like that. But I think this generation of scholars, and at least you all gathered here, are finding more porous and kind of like nimble ways of saying, like, look, the crisis taught our generation that you can't think through any of these problems anymore, if we once could, without thinking about the reproduction of capital. And that's what Marx's toolbox is so good for. So the racisms we have are, in this era, capitalist racisms. The patriarchal distortions of any sex and gender system that predated capital are now capitalist forms of a sex gender system, and on and on and on. And so it seems to me that your generation is giving a great analytic gift to scholarship, for sure, but also, I hope, for certain kinds of political organizing in the coming years. So with that in mind, it seems to me that this phrase social form is really interesting, right? So social here, at the very simplest thing, can mean like not just economic. And it opens the door to like, what do we mean then by the social, right? And form, I think one way that we can think about it, that I've heard you all touching on in different ways, is, first of all, just not like formalism, like form in some rigid sense, but a reproducible thing. That's maybe one of the roots of, I think, what you all share is a real sensitivity to the way that capital didn't just win, but it has to keep winning every day. It needs to reproduce itself. And what are its strategies for doing so? They're all reproductive strategies. They're very path dependent. A lot of prior victories have made its strategies so invisible to us, we don't even think of them as class strategies anymore at all. But I think what you all are doing when you think about social form is getting us past, of course, that thing about economism that maybe friends and relatives you have think of as the way to dismiss Marx, like, well, my struggle is not an economic one. But I think form is also not something that's not just like consciousness, true or false. And the way you're thinking about form suggests that there's a million ways to have a relationship, a conscious one, an implicit one, a half aware one, an exhausted trying to get it right but can't do it alone one. There's something about focusing on forms and their reproduction that allows us to think about all the different kinds of consciousness that are out there in the political actors we might want to work with, and also the ones we feel that we're opposed to. So I think the way that you all on this call and many people that maybe you referred to in the immediate generation prior or whatever, are doing something really interesting with the meaning of the social and the meaning of form. And that's one link I see among you. Now, partly what seemed to me so great about this series of presentations is that you all have distinct but overlapping approaches to that. So in the case of kind of giving us earlier accounts of what a fetish was in Marx, not only to speak of like, extra or non-Marxist versions of, the fetish, but like fetishistic social form, Chris. One of the things I really tuned into towards the end of your presentation was the idea of being, people are compelled to be bearers of an economic category. And that could be a lot of different kinds of categories. And also, I think implicitly, what it means to be a bearer isn't necessarily static or uniform, right? Like not only during the workday, at the end of the workday, but across the course of a life, in different places and times. In different senses. But so that, I think so the sort of question about like, what does that idea about fetishism and having to be representative of something, consciously or not, affirmatively or not, tell us about social form? Amy, in your case, of course, the word abstraction is in the title of your book. And the word totality, the concept of totality is so important to the work you do in your book. And I think there's something about the way you give us a language for how, if we think from the perspective of the whole, which is hard to do alone, but we've got lots of help from our friends and comrades. When we try to do that, we get better at seeing that capital is happening everywhere and all the time, but in no one place and at no one time in the exact same way. And I take you to be saying that poetry, maybe some other arts too, maybe some other ways of talking and being with each other, is really great at helping us see the always partial realization of a thing that can nonetheless point us towards what's going on, everywhere all at once, even if it's not looking the same everywhere all at once. And I think that's another really interesting opening up that's, though it's phrased in terms of totality and abstraction, as opposed to say what Chris is thinking about through his study of the fetish. There's something very porous and open-ended about both of those things. And then, Naima and Andy, I think that when you think about the relationship between the productive and the unproductive sphere, or value dissociation, you're also talking, of course, about a form of reproduction of people being forced out of the wage, prevented from entering into the wage relation, expelled and only ever partly reincorporated because they got injured or they're too old or they're not peasants anymore and they want a higher wage. All those things that Marx talks about in Capital Volume 1. But my hand's going back and forth like this because for you, it seems to me, as for Marx, that's a constantly shifting boundary. And I am fond of the word ratio, but there's something that never quite settles. And so if you're looking at an individual life in labor, whether you're looking at a labor in class or a stratified set of classes in a given time and place, I think the tools that you're helping us draw out of Marx that help us specifically think about racialization also have to do with how racialization in general, anti-Blackness in the North American and Caribbean and maybe South American context in particular, always has to be reproduced. And in that sense, just as an asterisk, I guess I would say that you seem to me like really interesting fellow travelers for the also collaborative work that Christian and Rika Chandra are doing that is so much about the differing class strategies that reconstrue what race needs to mean for new tactics of stratification. So Naima, in your presentation, you were talking about these early territorial and religious or creedal things that then capital comes along and reconstrues primarily negatively, but not being paid anything itself starts to mean many, many different things because there's so many ways not to be paid, right? So all of you, I think, have these really interesting relationships through fetishism, through abstraction and totality, through that kind of being kept out, but in relation to those being dragged in, that are very flexible and double-facing ways of thinking about what the social is and ways of thinking about form is that are neither economistic nor formalistic. And I just think that's a really cool thing that you're all doing from different angles. And so my question would just be or it wouldn't be a question, it'd be discuss. How do you all, now that you've had a chance, and I know you've all kind of been aware of each other's work anyway, but listening to each other talk now over the last hour, how much you want to think about the connections you see between your research and those on the call who are doing stuff alongside you. I think it's exciting, and it would be cool for our audience to hear a little bit about that. And I'm not the teacher, so I'm not going to call out anybody.
I could just say something briefly to get us going, which I think, and thank you, Chris, for that wonderful synopsis of everything we're doing here. I really appreciate that. And I would say that, the question or the point about social form and how do we define social form? Actually, somebody asked that in a reading group I was in recently, and even though we use that term all the time, we were a bit stumped that would take a whole paper. But I was thinking about we could think of it in terms of forms of appearance as a reproducible thing. And that also leads us to think about what doesn't take form, what doesn't take that kind of form, at least, which for many of us, I think, is an important feminist question, especially, and leads us to thinking about negative dialectics and negative form, kind of form determination by exclusion, as in Andy and Naima's excellent essay. And I was thinking about actually listening to Andy and Naima just now about how social form has to do with the nexus of form and relation. So social relation, which is abstract, which can't be represented. But when we think about forms of appearance and social relations together, what we get is, and not just in terms of that, we get away from a form of thinking that limits us to thinking about what's legible and what's not, which is very useful work, but helps us, I think that way of approaching it helps us to think about what in Andy and Naima's paper, I think Andy was describing as Gillian Rose's way of opposing the speculative and dialectical view of history versus a sociological or reflective definition of a collection of facts, right? And the point, I think, is that both make up what we call reality, right? And I think that, and Andy and Naima put that so well in the essay that I've read I've read a draft of the essay too. So I wonder if others would want to say more about form and relation together, or that nexus, or whatever you want to call it.
I mean, I could just very briefly bring our moderator into the conversation too. Like, this is a very basic Hegelian point as well, which is just that you don't have perceptibility or like phenomenological experience of the world without relation, right? I think in a panel at MLG like a couple of years ago, Chris said something like it's relationality all the way down, which is a phrase that's stuck in my head. It's really pithy and beautiful. But yeah, these are twinned processes, and the relationality that can take place in the abstract is also constantly moving, and is the reason that you don't have a static, ontologically fixed appearance of something like race or gender. It's just not possible, because these things, as Chris was also saying, are just kind of constantly necessarily in flux, and they exist in relationship to a process of domination that is also constantly in flux and moving and finding new places to establish itself and to create conditions of immiseration. So that would be my brief addition there.
I have one thought on how I might, well, it's related to a question I wanted to ask you, Amy, from your talk. Maybe also to unfortunately also refer to Hegel. I've well, maybe first I'll bring in Beverly Best's work again, because again, Amy, you were sort of in conversation with it at various points in your talk and in your book. I've always, and maybe this also is about the retrospective sort of uptake of, say, like wages for housework or things like this, because I've always thought that a great point that Bev makes in her wages for housework redux essay is one thinking about this sort of history of this question of the debates over the productivity of domestic labor, where sometimes that was, the debate seemed grounded by some idea that productive labor was normatively valorizable labor. So the stakes seemed to be that if one could demonstrate that domestic labor was productive labor, then one would be demonstrating something about the radical potential or the like political salience of domestic labor for a emancipatory movement. And I think it sounds like most of us are in the same page, where it's like, actually, one doesn't need to make that assumption about the sort of normative political salience of productive labor per se to see that the emancipatory project sort of would include domestic labor, that these are all sort of these can be different kinds of social relations, and at the same time all be part of the emancipatory project. So the way that this, I think, maybe gets to Hegel is that, and ultimately gets to a point that I wanted to ask you about, sort of lyric immediacy or pseudo-concreteness in relationship to questions of gender and domestic labor, is I've been thinking about sort of the way in which Marx recalibrates Hegel's presentation of ethical life in the philosophy of right, where what Marx will spend his entire life on the dynamics of political economy is one of the terms for Hegel, which is the sphere of particularity, the sphere of needs, civil society. But there's the family and there's the state for Hegel on both sides of that. And interestingly, Marx doesn't say those things don't exist in his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, but rather he says they become tendentially sort of subordinated systemically, like the family is going to basically get inflected by the demands and crises of the market. But it's not as if it does not also, insofar as it is not the market immediately, it's still going to have kind of its own logics of relation, even if they're sort of have this negative pressure put on them to change in particular ways. But that doesn't mean they substantially become the market. That just means they are under pressure to change their content with respect to the crisis of capitalism. And so in that sense, I've always found useful the way that Hegel describes the relations of care or of the family as relations of immediacy, in the sense that it is not the sort of particularity of the market. It's rather a sort of, these ideas of the seemingly the ethical logic of loving or caring for somebody has an aspect of singularity. It's supposed to be like, I'm not loving someone as a type of person, I'm loving them as a singular person. Or I'm, when I'm like, why should I care for a person? It seems inappropriate to give the particularizing logic, say, of the market. One has to rather, it seems built into it that it has an immediate justification. It's supposed to be felt as immediate, or at least that's the sort of language of those sorts of relations in some way. And so this struck me in the sense that you were talking about the pseudo-concreteness of the lyric poem, which struck me as a kind of form of immediacy, right? Or like how to think these two things together. That seems to be there is a kind of question of immediacy when we're thinking about both the aesthetic object, but also the question of domestic relationships or relationships of care and social reproduction in that sense. I wonder, but maybe this is all just a much too elaborate way of asking you to expand on this question of sort of the relationship between the pseudo-concreteness, as you call it, or the immediacy, or the sort of, at some point, I think you say, there's something beyond conceptual thoughts. There's a sensibility with respect to totality that is evidenced in the poets you're looking at, rather than a kind of conceptual syllogistic representation, say, of totality.
Wow, thank you. Thanks, Sandy. That's thank you for that wonderful question. I think I have too many things to say about all this, I think, in terms of speaking to Bev's work in the first place, and the way that, that Wages for Housework Redux article that you mentioned does such a great job of showing us how capital wants to abstract all it can, but capital in history, in the marketplace, it can't do that, because capitalists don't act in the pure interest of capital, they act in their own interests, right? So then you get a version of the logic history contradiction that I think many people have written about. And so some of the methods, I think, that Beverly Best is outlining there point us to, as with her other work too, point us to think about where ideology takes place and how it produces subjects. And with regards to the pseudo-concreteness, when I mentioned that, I was thinking about Marina Vishmit's work and the way that a couple of her critiques have described this pseudo-concreteness as a resistance in feminist work to thinking about abstraction, as the insistence on bodies, we could maybe even use the term invariant from what's invariant from your paper there as well. And the problem with that, and what I see a lot these poets as specifically not doing when they're thinking about embodied experiences or the intuitive or affective or sensory aspects of experience. The problem with the pseudo-concreteness, which Vishmit associates with feminist new materialisms, with that time of object-oriented ontologies and things, the thinking in feminist thought, especially around this kind of buzzing between bodies and the protest kind of thing. Vishmit's point about that was that it imagines that there's a productive body, maybe a caring body, that it's productive, but we never ask, the question never arises from where is that body produced. So the poets I'm studying, in contrast to that, are doing this amazing thing, I think, of registering through various formal techniques often, and through movement and meter and rhythm in poems often too, as well as, you know, all the other things that poetry has at its disposal. They're managing to connect that immediate experience to a social totality in a way that actually, I think, shows that it's not immediate at all. It's always mediated. So I'll leave it there, but yeah, that's the contrast I'm trying to bring out. And thank you so much for that question.
Chris, do you want to hop in just to kind of that sort of question about, you know, I mean, now there's additional stuff on the table, but, you know, just like how you might have been thinking about the presentations or some of the other keywords that organize this fellow traveling work.
Yeah, I mean, I am still thinking about the presentations and your very helpful comments. And I think another thing we could say that they have in common, as was just mentioned, is also thinking about like the importance of mediation and the mediation between, you know, well, we could say between social form and, you know, well, between the social and form, between essence and appearance. And I think maybe I want to say, I think another thing that's important is, you know, I think as Amy talked about, right, there was this move away from sort of false consciousness, right, to focusing on things as objective. And the argument there used to be like, you know, essence must appear, right? But I think another important thing that the other papers are really focusing on is, you know, that there's also like this other side of how an essence appears, what it, you know, what it leaves out. And, you know, how that moment is also essential, and how it's essential to also focus on that rather than just appearance. So I think those are also two important themes that I think, you know, I saw in the papers and sort of build on the comments that you were making, Chris.
That's great. That makes a lot of sense to me. And I think, again, you know, maybe post 2016, 2020 in the US, when you begin to see the consolidation of kind of like broadly democratic social left, even if it's minuscule compared to what it could be, it's exciting on the one hand, but also it raises questions of what a truly international version of economic justice would look like, so that improved, you know, working conditions for people who've been left behind and left out of some normal version of American life, how that could be bought, if not at the cost of people working in other places under other conditions. And it sounds like you're just being a negative downer person, but, you know, maybe you're just trying to get to the root of the problem so we don't go through another cycle of running up against the same barriers we always do, right? I think that's one of the most interesting problems that people trying to do political organizing in light of really strong theorizing face today, is how to like really be honest about the whole shebang without that being, and while making that mobilizing instead of demoralizing. Sort of like getting a grip on whether or not we want to say it's a David and Goliath situation, or it's, you know, Goliath and a million Davids or whatever. But we do have a question from the thread from no less than Philip himself. And he would like to hear you guys maybe think about another use of the social that kind of predates, you know, the contemporary thinking that's been so productive about social form. And he's asking about the phrase social imaginary. He says, do you think people who use the phrase social imaginary were groping for a category like social form? And he was curious, like, what would you say is the gap between those things? I don't know if that phrase rings a bell for you. For me, it makes me think of like Chantal and Mouffe, or Cornelius Castoriadis in the 70s, or Charles Taylor, the, you know, imaginary social, I forget the title of the book, but, you know, social imaginaries, it's a big term for him too. So, you know, work 70s, 80s, 90s, right up until the early 2000s, that's, you know, using that phrase. Philip's saying, you know, I wonder if people were using that phrase, were groping for something like what you're doing, or whether there's some other relationship between that idea and the ideas that you're processing or testing out about social form? It's an interesting question. Does that phrase ring a bell for you all? I mean, it is like a, like it seemed to me like a way for different kinds of thinkers, some of them like para-Marxists or formerly Marxists, or like very pluralist Marxists, very friendly to psychoanalysis or whatever, to try to see, it seems to me to say that there's, there's something else besides so-called determinism, and it seems to me that since you all don't, Philip says a phrase that dates me. Well, maybe it dates me that I sort of know what it means. That like they seem like anti-determinist. It seems like an anti-determinism language, but it seems maybe what Philip's partly getting at is like you've already arrived at such a robustly non-determinist understanding of how capital works that maybe social form does stuff without having to have the burden of saying, like, unlike Marx, where everything's economic, people have inner lives that connect to each other at protests or whatever, like what you were saying, Amy, about the buzzing bodies,
Yeah, I mean, just one very short thought is that that phrase social imaginary, I think of it as something that's grasping for a concept for the limits of the imagination, or the limits of so an anti-deterministic concept of how we think within political horizons. Or I'm thinking of that big first chapter of Jameson's The Political Unconscious right now as well, the different limits of historical imaginary within a particular period, which seems related to, and I wonder if, I hope this doesn't sound like bombastic, but I wonder if those of us working now, including you, Chris, don't need that anymore, maybe because social form does better work, or does it? I don't know.
I mean, I happen to think it does, and you've all helped teach me that. Chris, you said something in the. I hope this is okay. You said something in the chat. Is this linked to totality? I wonder, if you want to unmute yourself and just say a little bit more about what you meant.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it's been a long time since I've read anything about this. But right, wasn't it? Also, didn't some of the approaches to sort of social horizon, as well as sort of trying to take maybe like a strategic, like conjunctural approach, didn't a lot of it also focus on like so I was thinking about it in terms of like totality sort of viewed that way, like as a way of maybe like mapping, like cognitive mapping society in a certain way. But I guess maybe a difference would be, and I could be totally wrong about this, wasn't the focus on it more sort of like I want to say like linguistic, like looking for like drawing on like sort of, for lack of a better term, sort of like post-structuralist
like discourse.
Yeah. So maybe we want to argue or hope that sort of social form is a more sophisticated.
It's like an advance. It learns from the past. We figured out what some of the limits of those earlier discussions were, and we're trying to move beyond or something. I wonder, maybe we could close out with this, because this seems to circle around something I found very interesting that links you all too, which is that in different ways you're all thinking about like implicit and explicit ways we have together of describing, thinking about, maybe conceptualizing our relationship to life under capital. And, and maybe, Philip, this is partly what you were thinking about. It does seem to me that social imaginaries language was meant to be the like language of the day for like that which is under theorized or not fully conceptualized, with the unfortunate perhaps implication that once you did conceptualize it, if you became a good Marxist, then you had to give up all the stuff that was intuitional and like really like micro about your experience to focus on the struggle, right? Whereas that's just not like what the last couple of generations seem to think is what you have to do. Like you have to give up a bunch of stuff in order to really become clear about how capital works. Rather, understanding how capital works helps you make sense of a lot more of the micro stuff in a hopefully non-deterministic way. I mean, my preferred language is kind of like the idea of the center of gravity that capital creates. And just like the planet and its gravitational field creates like an infinite variety of species and ecosystems and ways of life, so too does capital's center of gravity, which is kind of shifting around all the time, like make all kinds of attitudes and political comportments and investments and fears and resignations and militancies possible all over the place. Seems like the opposite of determinism in some ways to me. But whether we think about poetry or sort of like gaps and impasses in political organizing, like Naima, you and Andy were pointing at, or whether we think about prior ways of reducing things into binaries about false or true consciousness, Chris, I wonder if you could just like maybe close out our conversation about social form and just like what it means to I guess for me, the thing I always come back to is Gramsci's wonderful distinction between common sense and good sense. It's not like some people are dumb and some people are smart, but like maybe that's, is like something like that. I'd love to hear you all just talk about your approach to how, in 2026, we're at a place where these different theoretical traditions and our attempts to get a better places with them can help us specifically with that. It's how we like argue with our comrades or argue with people who we think we might convince or like, who are on the fence, what it means to have a strong concept that doesn't reduce everything, or what it means to think clearly without thinking reductively or whatever. Like, I think we've been talking about that a little bit. So maybe that'd be a nice place for us to end, is just like to dip into that for a second from each of your research projects or your perspectives, or even just like from listening to each other over the last hour or so.
Shall I go first again? Oh, Naima.
I mean, unless you want to.
You go.
Okay. I like this question a lot. It's very important to me. I think there's something really interesting about the common sense understanding of what Marxism is that shows up in organizing spaces right now. It's happening, I think, like I haven't spent a ton of time in tracing all of this, but my sense is that like something happened in the wake of identity politics, where in a kind of and actually I think Chris talks about this in his book a little bit as well, in a different register. An entire intellectual history kind of got swept under the rug with respect to like Black intellectuals who were very firm Marxists, and something emerged, that some version of Marxism emerged that was this kind of like a social movement that was Marx and Lenin, and not even Marx and Lenin themselves, but just like popularized versions of what Marx and Lenin were doing, and that was kind of it. But then you come back and you're like, well, what about Du Bois? Or what about like Ruth Wilson Gilmore, or what about like all of these towering intellectual figures for whom not that long ago, Marxism was a really central feature of the struggle. So a lot of my way of talking to folks with whom I'm sympathetic, but who are also kind of not wanting to think of capitalism as a center of gravity, as Chris was saying, a lot of it is just like being a good intellectual historian, and knowing what other people have said, and being able to say, well, have you read this person, or like there's also a certain generosity in that gesture as well, because as I said a little bit in my presentation, it's also not every critique of Marxism coming out of these other political impulses is completely false or completely baseless. But yeah, it has to be an ongoing conversation. That wasn't a very rigorous response. That was just a top of my head.
So great.
Anyway,
yeah, that's great. I also love the idea. It's very temperamentally suitable to me to think about certain kind of, comradely conflict where one move is like, have you considered my reading group?
Yeah, that was going to be my answer. More reading groups and only reading groups. This is maybe a not, I'm not going to give the theory of how we reconstitute the international socialist movement, unfortunately, but I do think we kind of brought this up, I think, earlier in the Q&A, but this idea, a lot of the presentations today reminded me of what, when I first read it, was a great, I felt was a, groundbreaking insight for me from Lukács, where he says that, Genesis is not essence, is what he says, where it's like the origin of a social phenomenon does not tell you the sort of essential character of it or what it means in the moment. This idea that, like, in fact, these things that could sort of have, like, and so, of course, this is relevant when we're thinking of these sort of, like, especially in the case of our paper, where we're thinking about these forms of oppression that look like they extend to a pre-capitalist thing, like Juliet Mitchell, the longest revolution, right? This idea that when we're talking about these categories of social difference, they look like things that one would have to go back to, the first time we, like, crawled out of the ocean as mammals to figure out, like, what the problem is. But really, the problem is, I think, maybe an equally daunting one, or that it asks for a lot of boldness, but it's to say that, like, well, actually, it's what the thing is in the present, and the whole history of it is subordinated to its place in the present, and it only means something insofar as it's the task of the present to overcome it as a sort of freedom problem. So I think that is like a useful corrective, maybe especially for, like, left academics who really like our deep histories, to be like, well, actually, the politics of people in the everyday organizing world, they don't really care, what's the deep historical genealogy of this problem that you're seeing. But it's also like that deep historical genealogy really doesn't mean anything for theory until you know what it means for that person now anyway. So you might as well be ready to adopt that sort of, the sort of speculative or, like, willingness to be open to the way that forms change or mean different things now in ways that sometimes the left might be behind the ball in always looking at kind of the last form, or instead of having a openness to sort of being like, how could things be radically different but equally as unfree as they were, like, 10 or 50 years ago or whatever.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Amy, Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Andy and Naima as well, I really like your emphasis on what we need to do to be sensitized to new forms of social differentiation as well, rather than looking for what we already know, seems so important. And I was just going to say, in response to the question about what's implicit, what's explicit, what's under-theorized, another thing that seems, I think maybe more and more, I talk about it in my book, but it's more and more obvious to more of us, I think, now, that there's what I would call in terms of thinking about identity categories and capitals differentials in those terms. I think in a lot of poetry, but also popular culture, all kinds of cultural forms now, you see what I would call a dialectics of identification and disidentification with those categories or forms of difference, which surfaces in a lot of very vernacular ways as a kind of both and, like I am this, but I'm also not just this. I am this, and it's not reducible to irony either, and a kind of ironic occupation of that category. It's sincere as well, often, I think. So it isn't like I can have it all. It's not nihilistic either. It's not like it doesn't matter what we do. It's coming, I think, from a shared new consciousness of what social forms are, what social categories are, and how we all disidentify from them in so many different ways, and in hierarchical ways too. So in terms of, the implicit, explicit question got me thinking about that. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah. Thanks, Amy.
I think another, maybe a way that I would try and tie these together would be to bring back this idea of pseudo-concreteness, right? And link it to abstraction, right? But then also tie these to the importance of thinking about self-reflexivity and practice, right? Not practice as in like what is it that we should do, but practice as in being self-reflective of how, right, how the abstract and the concrete, which I think all the presentations show, are all, expressions of social practice and sociality. And, maybe the argument for people taking these approaches seriously is, pointing to that, right? Rather than seeing it as sort of abstract academic theorizing that doesn't have anything to do with struggle, right? What it really does is it describes and explains everyday struggles, right? The everyday struggles that we do and how our everyday practices, right, both creates and, going back to what people have been talking about, reproduce these social forms, and are part of them, right? There's not this like separation, which it is nice to insist upon, and maybe this is a leftist form of disavowal to see them as like separate from the activities that we all do, but maybe that's also a sort of an argument for their importance, and why I hope people would be open to sort of taking them into consideration when thinking about strategy, right? Because the ultimate goal, right, is, right, to stop practice, right? To stop the practice that we're doing, and I guess hopefully, right, that's the argument for keeping these types of analysis in mind, because they try, and I think more successfully than others, grasp it through these categories, through these analyses, through these critiques.
That's really nice, Chris. I'm going to do something funny here and suggest that you, in your remarks, Chris, may have beautifully provided an answer to kind of like one last question from the thread, which I'll read out loud and see what we all think. And then I think Philip would like to hop on and say goodbye to everybody. But we got a question that said, I'm just curious, can we consider Marxism as a certain style of meta-philosophy? And if we can, what role does the concept of social form that we've been discussing play in Marxism? Now, probably what I heard you saying, Chris, and in a way that it felt to me like was synthesizing a bit of what everybody was saying across the course of our conversation, is that the style of thinking that we're trying to test out and model has this really like living relationship between stuff that feels like replicable and abstract and kind of like right in front of our eyes, immediate, has to be dealt with. And it seems like historically, maybe devolving from Hegel, but Marxists have gotten really good at kind of saying, well, what counts as theory at one point or another is going to be different than what counts as theory. Some problem that was really hard to solve is going to become second nature. It doesn't even feel philosophical anymore because we really learn from our mistakes or whatever. I kind of heard you saying things, all of you, but some of the way you were summarizing things, Chris, felt a little bit like that to me. And I don't know if that's like an acceptable way of maybe answering our listener's question about meta philosophy, but it crossed my mind from the way you were all talking, and if that were the case, and you all thought maybe that were decent as an answer, it seems also that a lot of the ways you're talking about social form is like a local model of that thing that is like, well, we're always doing theory and practice at the same time in some way, and we do it in a certain site and place where we're struggling with like how densely, your experience has been determined by being racialized the way you have, that form, or how densely or ineradicably the way that you've been gendered or seek to be gendered determines how you want to struggle with other people. And that seems like really closely related to like how hard or how porously we want to think when we think. I'm trying to do a lot of synthetic work here at the end of our nearly 2 hours now together, for which I'm very grateful. I hope for our member of the audience who asked that question, that can serve at least as a way to think about, what your moderator heard among some of these comments. Does that feel decent to everybody? Is that all right? Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. I know for myself, I imagine maybe for you too, it's a great resource to have the record of these conversations online. You miss a session at Red May, and then it's there for you to go back to and maybe revisit. I've found that very valuable. So thank you to Chris B in the background, who's been making sure that this has gone smoothly. And thank you all. Philip, do you want to hop on and say goodbye to everybody? But you're muted. Maybe Chris P can unmute you. We can't hear you. Oh no. Philip, we're losing precious words of yours.
We're losing. Okay.
Okay.
Well, goodbye, everybody. Let's, it's terrific discussion. It will be revisited many times by me, and I'm sure by others. And goodbye to our audience. This is our last online presentation this Red May. We do have a special Red May in June coming up on the 4th, where Andy Gidlitz will be with Mets pitcher Trevor May, discussing the class struggle in baseball at Elliott Bay at 7 p.m. Thursday, June 4th. So come see us then and enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.